Without further ado, John, you have the stage.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike. Represent Force Ukraine. Just wanted to say that we do indeed have good times out in Ukraine, but financially, unfortunately, we have no disclosures. We probably wish that we did.
If anyone wants to give us something to disclose afterwards,
Yeah, I'd be happy to disclose whatever money you'd like to give us later. So as was said in the introduction, we gave a talk last year, basically titled St. Thaddeus GWAT. We wanted to come back this year and provide a little bit of an update 1 year on. And obviously there have been a lot of talks about Ukraine over the last 2 years in particular, but the last 3. And honestly, most of those have been really phenomenal. And I would encourage you to find those people who've given those talks and make sure that you hear their truth as well. As I said, my name is Mike. I am the team lead for Force Ukraine. I'm also the medical lead for TAPS International, which is a US-based organization based out of Dnipro and Kyiv. I live in Ukraine full-time starting in May. I'll let Kyle introduce himself.
my name is Kyle. I'm the CEO of Anyone Not Ready. We do a good bit of high-fidelity, low-vis UW type training. The prolonged field care training is how Mike and I ended up getting linked up, and I've been going over with the Force team for the last few years, doing these training missions. In total, the Force Ukraine team, many of whom are sitting right here in the front with us. So thanks to our teammates for coming in and supporting us, and those who couldn't be here watching on Instagram. Thanks guys for being here. But we've done 9 medical training missions in Ukraine, Force Ukraine. That was started, the 9 missions started in April of 22. Force put its first, organization put its first boots on the ground in July of 23. Since then, we've trained about 3,500 individuals. That training sometimes is just classroom-based or scenario-based, hands-on skills type trainings. But we've also done direct patient care. We've also been part of the evacuation system for wounded individuals. So some of the perspective that we have is both from the trainer's perspective, but also from the hands-on provider's perspective.
And to be clear, we do provide training. That is our primary mission. And while we have done direct patient care and evacuations, there are people I can see in this room who've done a lot more than we have in that sphere. And again, if you're interested in that aspect and the reality of providing care on the front lines, like Jennifer talked about yesterday, and the Azov gentleman talked about this morning, these are all things that we just further emphasize, but those are their experiences and their truths. While we specialize in teaching contextually appropriate best practice trauma medicine, we want to be very clear that we do not teach necessarily standards that some of you have held to be true for a very long time. Because one of the things that we've seen is that the mechanism of injury is changing the interventions that we need to do for those injuries. So while we talk about combat trauma in these kind of nebulous terms, what we need to understand is that the mechanisms of that trauma are changing. And so while we've had a lot of experience in country, we still maintain that we've got a very small optic on a very large problem. Ukraine is a huge country, and the front line is over 1,000 miles long. And so one of the things I can tell you is that there are no universal truths. If you've spoken to one unit or one medic and you've heard their experience, you've heard the experience of that one unit or one medic. So while we have tried to do the best we can to learn and extrapolate what they have told us into best practice, contextually appropriate medicine, it's based on conversations, less so in terms of direct experience on the front. I want to be very clear about that because people have made that very good point. But what we do try and do is learn as much as we can from our Ukrainian counterparts and the people that we train so that we then curate the way that we teach and the way that we train. And that will come into play later as we talk about some of the things that we should potentially be doing here to improve our own training to prepare for the next thing or the current thing, as the case may be. Like we said, we gave a very similar talk a year ago called the St. Thaddeus GWAT, and it was largely to focus on how do we extrapolate those lessons that we are seeing and learning in Ukraine and our Ukrainian counterparts are learning on a daily basis, and how do we push those back to to our warfighters and others who could stand to use those lessons. Because one of the things that we found, and we said it last year, was we learned a lot of the lessons of GWOT because we lived them. We were there over and over again, day in and day out. And we were all there together, the logisticians and the shooters and the medical personnel. And we learned those lessons together, coherently, as the Ukrainians are learning now. All of their elements have to work in synchrony for the process to work. And those are lessons that we feel, as we've come back a year later, are still potentially not being learned to their fullest degree. As other people have talked about, and we will not belabor the drone threat, but it's not just on the front lines. They have the ability on both sides to project very targeted, very precise power, 60 kilometers using some of the smaller drones, hundreds of kilometers using very, very low tech, the ability to loiter, to target ambulances, to target stabilization points, to target people well past what we would consider the front, to the point where there is no front anymore. Kyle will talk about that later. But basically what that does is it limits your offensive capability because they're able to strike you well before you can launch them. I was talking to SOCOM SEMA earlier about we always used to believe the front was out there somewhere, that you stepped out of the wire, stepped off the helo, and you went to the fight. Now the fight comes to you pretty easily. When I was doing evacs in November, we tried to paint our ambulance in different colors so it looked less obvious for the drones that were obviously hovering above us. These are the realities of when you also have to counter what's happening well off what we would consider the traditional fly. While that can be looked at as a detriment, as we've seen in the Ukrainian model, you can also use it to your advantage, allowing you to provide things like logistics and medical support well far forward if you needed to. I will make this point because I think a lot of us who've kind of grown up adjacent to the military-industrial complex don't fully understand how rapidly the evolution is occurring. In Ukraine, they can iterate an idea from tabletop to battlefield in about 3 weeks, especially on the drone side. Their official requisition for drones, their estimate is that they will produce 12 billion drones in calendar year 2026. The unofficial estimate, because all of the units are able to produce them organically, is that it will be likely closer to 20 million drones. I don't think we've actually thought about the scale of that and what that means. And when we think about drones, it's a one-off, or maybe it's a few. This is what true drone swarms look like, and this is how you enable it, by upscaling to this extent. And I think this is why we see, and anybody who has been in these exercises and who has had the Ukrainians come, or people who've been in Ukraine will tell you, we still fall woefully short when we start to integrate true drone technology. Not what we believe to be true, not the stuff that you can still jam because you think that that is your answer, but when the Ukrainians come and they bounce an FPV off your forehead because you're not prepared for the unjammable threat, we are still woefully behind in integrating the true threat and the true nature of this rapidly evolving piece of the war.
So one thing that we talked about last year was the evac timeline that it takes to get from the zero line, or what in the U.S. military, NATO military might call the FLET, back to kind of your first true stabilization point, your first kind of roll 2 minus type of care. Right, a year ago that was 18-ish hours that it took, which by itself, if you told any 68 whiskey out there, hey, so you're going to take casualties and you're going to take care for them for 18 hours before you can hand them off to any reasonable surgical capability, I'm pretty sure all of them would have a massive pucker factor. That number today is 4 days. Right? It's not getting shorter, it's getting longer, and the movements are getting more complex. Just to give you a little bit of background, like where we got these numbers from, these are our conversations with officials in Kyiv, but also direct conversations with units. And so we talked to 14 or 15 different units, all of whom were willing to share kind of their their estimates of how long it takes them to get to each of these locations through their evacuations, and so we combine those numbers to generate kind of the mean totals and the distances. And so this is not kind of our estimates so much as it's us taking the warfighter on the ground and their lived experience and simply projecting it for you. So this is not our data. This is their data that we're simply projecting for them to you. But that's I think one of the things to really think through this problem set is, what is it that we are planning on, right? We're planning on launching how many C-130s and Blackhawks and Little Birds, and how many of your different units were a part of recovering 2 individuals, a few weeks ago, and how realistic is that when that fight is a broader scale or is more involved, right? That is not a realistic mindset for us to have, but it's one that we continue to perpetuate because, it worked. We got away with it, and therefore it must be okay. It must be the way that things are going to go in the future, and that's not necessarily the case. I think we need to take a deeper look at what the data is actually telling us out of Ukraine and start preparing for the reality that is going to come, not the reality that we still think that we can impose on a battle space.
Yeah, Kyle has hit on a number of these, but we definitely feel that the U.S. adoption of lessons identified is lacking. And we get that organizational change is hard, and what we'll talk about in a little bit is the smaller things that we can do while we're waiting for the larger organization to catch up. But on the tactical level, on the operational strategic level, there are things that we can do right now. But when we talk about the way that we do training, that there is a significant information, that the Ukrainians have been not just willing partners, but very open partners with the data, with the information that they're seeing, wanting to share that back with us. There is so much information that's available regarding types of wounds that we're seeing, and therefore an ability for us to start to adjust the types of medicine and the types of interventions that we're training at every level. And these are the things that we are seeing out there. We're seeing how the traditional tactical medical model that we have not only exported to the Ukrainians over the last 4 years, but have used to train ourselves, in many ways doesn't answer the types of interventions that we need or the types of injuries that we're seeing in a way that effectively allows us to provide the best possible care. One of the things that we're struggling with right now is how to teach people how to do differential diagnoses, because not everything you see falls into the very easily categorized, for lack of a better term, number of wound patterns that were pretty common in the types of war we fight, and quite frankly still are. And I'm not saying everything is obsolete. The conversation that the PJs had this morning, there is still a need for very good T-Tri-C March-based protocol. And yet when we look at the LISCO environment, we need to take that next step. And we need to talk to our Ukrainian counterparts and the people who are working there and improve the way that we're training based on that available data. As Kyle mentioned, when we look at some of the issues that are still come to play here, we do believe that the old ways will always work. I give other briefs, and I'm told that America doesn't necessarily have to worry about that because within 100 days we'll have air dominance. And that may be true strategically, but that does not take into account the tactical air threat that every single drone on the battlefield provides. We're slow to evolve, slow adaptations to a rapidly evolving battlefield. As I said, the drone iteration is weeks. It is not at the pace of the U.S. military-industrial complex, where we develop things and they go into production and they're available 18 months later. The things that we saw 18 months ago in Ukraine are obsolete in Ukraine, okay? And so there are these significant delays in accepting the fact that we need to make some critical changes now. And I think some of the more recent experiences that people who are either in this room or who are currently deployed would assure you is that those changes are already potentially a little bit late. And And so I would advise and I would encourage that we take the chance now to really start to implement these simple techniques and things that we should do.
So these problems that we're seeing in Ukraine, the context shift and the way that the war is shifting, I think gives us an opportunity to identify some areas where we can actually do some real adjustments to the way that we train, the types of things that that we train. If you just look at Operation Epic Fury, right, how many mass cows came about in the response to our initial actions in Operation Epic Fury, and how many of them were actually in the AO of conflict? Exactly 0, right? There is no front line, right? Everywhere where opposition forces are is now the front. There is no, hey, we're just going to go take some R&R back in Dubai, or we're going to go back to Kuwait and we're going to kick the heels up for a little while. Like that doesn't exist in the next war. And so how do we think through the problem set of having our troops ready to do rest and refit cycles where you're under constant threat, regardless of where you think you're redeploying to, right? Where is that problem set being solved? Which leaders are sitting down and having those conversations? Other conversations that we need to be having, right, are around the things we're learning in Ukraine that we can bring in, right? Your prolonged field care issues, and I think this has been hit quite a number of times. I don't need to belabor a number of other speakers who've gone very deeply on this. I think the piece of it that is important to reemphasize is that prolonged field care isn't to do TRC harder. Right? Prolonged field care isn't, well, the injury patterns from Iraq and Afghanistan were fill in the blank. Let's take care of them for 24 hours instead of 4 hours. Right? Let's take care of them for 30 hours instead of 12 hours. That's not the correct mindset from our perspective. We've got to start looking at what the actual injury patterns are from the Ukrainian conflict, from conflicts similar to Ukraine. I was talking with one of the other gentlemen earlier this week, and he was showing me a new wearable face mask trainer that they had come up with. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. It happens to very closely resemble a drone operator injury that we're very familiar with and actually use as a case study to start most of our trainings. And he chuckled and went, well, that's interesting because I pulled this from World War I. Right, as Mr. Gonzalez would say, if you want a cool new idea, read a really old book. Right, but the new things, or the things that we're not talking about, one in particular that I really do want to emphasize is the idea of the blast lung, right? And something that is not hit on very well in our current methodologies, our current training methodologies, right? What is the answer to shortness of breath? Right, progressive shortness of breath and weak lung sounds. A needle to the chest, right? We're going to decompress that. Like, that is what the training manual says to do. What happens if you do that to a patient with blast lung? Right, you are, maybe not signing the death warrant, but you're coming pretty close, right? The ability to, as Mike was saying, talk about those differentials and really be able to actually work through what is it that I'm dealing with has to be pushed down to the lowest levels. We can't just say, oh, well, the soft medics know how to do that. Your SYDCs and your PJs and your deltas, like, they'll figure that one out. Well, cool. What about the 68 Whiskey who's actually dealing with this in the trench on the regular basis? And where's that training coming from, and how are we going to align to that? There's a bunch of others up there that we can talk about. You can come find us afterwards. But let's get into some actual recommendations that we can walk through at each of the echelon levels here.
I want to leave this slide up for just a second, because as we talk about the changes that we need to make on the tactical level, I want you to think about what Kyle just said. If we think about where the fight in many cases is in Ukraine, if anyone was in Jennifer's talk yesterday, she's an N of 1 across the front. Okay, so most of the time, these incredibly complex injuries that they're identifying are not necessarily being dealt with by a senior medical person, or even necessarily somebody with a lot of medical experience at all. And if we extrapolate that out to when a bunker gets hit in Kuwait or a chow hall or something else. Is your SOIDC there? Are your 18 deltas there? No, generally speaking, they're already arrayed against what we believe to be pretty complex injuries. We have to understand that our lowest level of tactical field care doesn't address any of these. It certainly doesn't address them appropriately. And we know that there are other manuals and CPGs and other things like that. We'll talk about that in a second. But I just want you to keep in mind, these are the injuries that are being dealt with on the front. And as we talked about, the front may be the front as we understand it. The front may be kilometers back, where you don't have specialized medical resources. And I think we're seeing that play out in real time right now. We've seen it play out in real time over the last couple of months in our own conflict. So as we look to these recommendations for improvement in each echelon, the first thing I want you to remember on the tactical side is that we will probably not necessarily have qualified medical personnel present at every point of injury. And so what do we do? And 2 years ago when we were here, the Wounded Warrior presentation was given by Max Serkin. And one of the things he talked about was training down. Train the people underneath you, because when they had that accident, as the trauma surgeon, his realization was the only person who could have fixed him and the other 30 guys on that bird was him. And he was out of the fight. And so how do you address these massive training issues such that your admin folks, your loggies, have at least a modicum of pertinent training? And the things that we would recommend are go away from some of the things that we don't see very often. Kyle mentioned decompression. We know tension pneumothorax is extremely rare, and yet I guarantee almost everyone in this room knows all your landmarks and exactly how to do it. That said, is everyone in this room, would you trust the people next to you to start an IV on you? Because while we're seeing the drone delivery of blood and plasma, does that matter if the person you deliver it to doesn't know how to provide access for that to go in?
And yes, we realize there's a bunch of doctors out there when we ask the IV question.
You know, the gentleman from Azov talked this morning, and there's a slide downstairs talking about how you train people to get vascular access, IO or IV, such that you can drop critical life-saving material to somebody to get that first unit of blood or plasma on in that critical window, such that you could potentially get them lily-padded to the next point of care. In the talk yesterday that Jennifer gave, she's training a lot of her folks to give IM injections, to do PO medication. What are the things that we can push down such that the layperson, if you will, can provide that modicum of care so that you can get somebody who would otherwise not make it to that next echelon, given the time frames that we're talking about? Similarly, when we look at tourniquet conversion, and I know this has been belabored over the last few years, but one of the things we've seen is cyclical. So everyone got tourniquets, and then we saw the problems with prolonged tourniquets, and now there's a rush to convert. And because there's that rush to convert, two things are happening. One, gross contamination of wounds, because they're rapidly just trying to pack and control them and then replace that with the pressure dressing. The second thing is, even if you fall outside of that 2-hour window, you know the alternative is limb loss. So are you willing to do it up to 6 hours? And a lot of people are trying. A lot of people are ending up on dialysis. We must train past that 2-hour window, because you know that if you were put in that situation, you would try it too. And we owe it to the people who are put in that situation to do the best we can for them. We'll talk about some of the issues with the training on that piece in a second. And then the last thing we would emphasize is at your tactical level, give them a telemed option, because I don't expect the guy in the trench or the guy in the chow hall to understand differentials. I don't expect them to know the difference between blast lung, tension pneumothorax, and contusion. But I want to give him that option. Because if the only thing he knows is, I've got shortness of breath and it's getting worse, I'm going to decompress, that is not the right answer. And we're doing both that person and the person who's getting that needle stuck in their chest, or multiple times, because the first one didn't work and it's still not, we still have a problem, so we should decompress again, because that's the answer. We owe both of those people a better answer. And that better answer has to be off of that point of injury. They have to have somebody they can reliably call, and somebody who doesn't just regurgitate the T-Tri-C guidelines back to them. They deserve somebody who understands the mechanism of injury, the findings, the demographic factors, if there are any, and can provide them good and appropriate guidance.
And so if you're sitting at the operational level and you're looking for, hey, what do I do? How can I, get my team ready? How can I get ready? How can I get my team ready for the next conflict? Let's start with this telemed concept. When was the last time, as a DACA PA, a senior Delta, right, a senior PJ, SIDC, you took a cold telemed call? No notice, no warning, you just took a cold call. And how'd that go for you? I see them sitting here in the front. She's had to take a couple of cold telemed calls from us in training, and right, you get better as you take more of them, but you have to intentionally take them cold. No warning about, hey, the telemed call's coming in at some convenient time so you can go get somewhere quiet. It's coming in on someone that you were told about what the injury pattern was, and so you could guide them to get to the training objective. Maybe we make both sides of the telemed equation better by making the calls cold. The other piece is at the operational level. If you're in the battalion med shop or your equivalent of the battalion med shop, when was the last time you actually refreshed and reblued your tactical medical abilities? Your ability to actually operate somewhere near the flat, right? Because that, if I were sitting, in the operational seat, is what I would be thinking about, right? How do I take my doc, my PA, my couple of senior providers, and get them out as far as I possibly can to support the warfighters who are far forward. You're not always going to get the sauce to come in, right? So our Major Merkel isn't going to jump in and save everybody all the time. We can only be in 3 places at once. And so, right, at some point, the resource gets limited, and it's going to fall to the individuals in those staff medical shops to not do the staff job, but to do the medical side of the job, which means you need the tactical capability to support your medical knowledge.
The last thing we want to hit on is the strategic guidance. And I want to bring this up very specifically because we talked about the tourniquet guidance. And right now, the closest analog to long tourniquet conversion comes out of our CRUSH protocol. Does anyone know when the CRUSH protocol CPG was last updated? 2016. Okay? We do not have a prolonged tourniquet conversion protocol. There's guidance in some of the other manuals, but generally speaking, that guidance for any conversion protocol is disparate and not necessarily clear. In some of the CPGs, it gives you a 2-paragraph, you should try this, with no instruction at all on how to actually do it. The other piece that we would recommend is that understand who your end user is. The CPGs, if you look at the minimum CPG for tourniquet for CRUSH, monitoring is done every 15 minutes by vital signs. So you're asking somebody who barely understands potential medicine to be able to not only give you a quantitative number, but a qualitative of pulses to see if there's been any delta from the time you release that tourniquet to now. The best guidance isn't better. It's, hey, look for changes on your ECG. Okay? We need to understand that when we write these CPGs and who we are ultimately writing them for, they are confusing probably to the best of us. Most of us in this room could figure them out. But how do we then talk those down to somebody who is at that point of injury, who needs to know how to effectively convert a tourniquet in that gray area of 4 to 5 hours, who may not have all of the things you want, who needs some sort of access or a fluid bolus to be able to ensure urine output, right? These are the things that really matter. And we can't just say, here are your CPGs, and here's your minimum, so therefore that's good enough for the lowest standard of care. The last thing, and I don't want to end on a down note, but this is the unfortunate truth. At the strategic level, as you do your exercises, and as you're the person in charge, as our Azov friends told us earlier, involve your officers. Make sure that they understand what the capability are, and then make sure your officers make that hard call to say, 30% of you are now out of this exercise, because that is the mass count, or 50%. And how do you maintain the ability to do anything? But how do you maintain the ability to do medicine in a contested environment when you are resource constrained, because your resources aren't just the things that you have, it's the people that you are. And every time we teach Belong Field Care is what are the resources that I have for the patients that I have for an undetermined amount of time. And that is the mindset we need to start flexing in on, is if we lose at the numbers the Ukrainians have lost, and we've heard everything from routinely 30% to 80% of an operational unit, how do you maintain the ability to do all of the other things that we claim are important? So close on that, I do just want to echo Kyle's thank you. There are a number of people in this room who've done a lot of work with us. There are a number of our Ukrainian counterparts. There are others in this room who have supported the work that we do. Honestly, this is largely a reflection of the Ukrainian effort and the Ukrainian work and the stuff that we've learned from them and others that work in that space. Obviously, a thank you to our team who are here and those that are watching. And if there are any questions, we'll happily take them now or outside.